Now to introduce today's host of MC, Kevin Crane. As AIIM's content strategist, Kevin authors ebooks and infographics on a wide variety of intelligent information management and digital transformation topics. He's the producer and host of AIIM's on-air podcast, which was recently listed on Forrester's 100 Best Channels podcast of 2021. Take it away, Kevin.
Thanks, Nina. Thank you so much. It's great to be back for another great AIIM webinar, this time about identifying the trends and minimizing the risks with your sensitive data. And look, the amount of information that organizations have to manage these days is staggering. You can pick any statistic that you'd like. In 2020 alone, 65 zettabytes of data was created in the US alone. And according to our own research here at AIIM, the volume of incoming content coming into our organizations is expected to grow by over 4.5 times in the next 2 years. Nearly 60% of all that content is unstructured. All this unstructured data represents two things. It's number one, it's a wealth of information and knowledge. It's a key opportunity for organizations to gather valuable insights and boost business intelligence, improve organizational performance. But it also poses a great deal of risk in terms of regulatory compliance, corporate integrity, legal exposure. So while much of all of this content that we create and manage is, all of it nearly, is strictly professional, legitimate, the fact is that private or inappropriate content may also have found its way into our repositories. So what risk does that represent to you and your organization? What kinds of personally identifiable information and other types of personal or embarrassing or even illegal content is out there? And what could happen as a result? Regulatory penalties if it's not managed properly, certainly. Legal exposure if it's discovered, quite possibly. Could it be embarrassing and a risk to how the organization is viewed in the market? It could happen. So here's the thing, what you don't know, you don't know what you don't know. And understanding and identifying what is hidden or overlooked in enterprise content repositories is vital for a number of important reasons. So that's what we'll be exploring today in today's webinar. How to proactively identify, mitigate, and prevent uncontrolled use of sensitive content, how things like AI and text analytics can help assess these vast amounts of content and determine risks within that unstructured information, and ways our organizations can increase efficiency and optimize governance incorporating these practices. So with that, I'd like to welcome our two great guests today, starting with Reed Cathcart. Reed is an analytics solutions consultant at OpenText, and he is an expert at data analysis. And along with Reed, Andy Tischholz joins us. He is a global industry strategist for compliance and legal at OpenText. Andy is an expert in e-discovery, information governance, and has over 20 years experience as a lawyer and a litigator and an in-house counsel. So gentlemen, welcome to the show today. Are you with me?
I am.
Yes,
well,
thanks. Nice to be here.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Reed. Andy, I'd like to start with you,
Sure.
if I could, to begin with. Reed, certainly jump in here with us as needed. But Andy, from your perspective, what are some of the trends in privacy and what are some of the impacts they are having on businesses and consumers today?
Great question. We see this a lot. I mean, a key trend right now, Kevin, is that privacy reform is accelerating rapidly around the world. Unbelievable pace right now. And what it's doing is providing much broader rights and protections for individuals. I've been talking about privacy for some time, and this isn't necessarily a topic that's entirely new to a lot of the people who are attending this program. It's just the focus is a little bit different. People have been looking at privacy from a regulatory retention or data protection activity for some time, generally around sort of industry-specific regulations. But that all changed, back when the GDPR went into effect in 2018. That ushered in this whole new world of data privacy compliance. It expanded individuals' rights significantly, and it also provided greater visibility, or the goal was to provide greater visibility and transparency into how data is being processed, collected, and used. And so if you look at this slide, the impact of GDPR has been and continues to be a real challenge around the world. This quote from Gartner says it all. 75% of the world's population is going to have its personal data covered under a modern privacy regulation by the end of 2023. And when I first saw this, because I've seen variations of this quote, I kind of laughed and chuckled a little bit and said, that's a pretty aggressive quote. But in reality, it's not. If you look at some of the flags I have listed up here, Brazil, China. Brazil passed its data privacy and protection law back in 2020. China recently passed it in November of 2021. And those are two of the largest countries, obviously, around the world. So those stats are not surprising. A lot of other countries, South Africa, Thailand, New Zealand, Japan, have enacted new or amended their existing laws a bit further. And then also you even have countries like India right now that are drafting bills right now through Parliament. So you can see that this is a real challenge. And in the US, it's interesting because there's no single comprehensive federal law regulating collection and use of PI. I mentioned just a few minutes ago about industry-specific regulations, right? So some of you may have been dealing with the headaches associated with protecting and identifying data with the Graham-Leach-Bliley, GLBA, or HIPAA, or even dealing with the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA. So there are all different ways that we've been dealing with this in the US, but not from that broader comprehensive data privacy viewpoint. The CCPA went into effect in 2020. That was the first statewide comprehensive privacy law. It was amended with CIPRA to give it even more comprehensive capabilities and protections. And then actually 3 more states, Colorado, Virginia, and actually just recently, I think it was March 24th, Utah signed its data protection laws. So another key trend, Kevin, on the trends topic is just the spending around privacy technology. I saw a study, I wrote it down before today, that worldwide privacy-driven spending on privacy protection and compliance technology is going to exceed $15 billion annually by 2024. So that's staggering. So it's no surprise that leaders attempt to, meet these requirements and start to build programs and tooling to do that. You asked me another question at the beginning, which had to do with impact on organizations and consumers. So let me see if I can jump in for a minute or so on that. So if you collect, process personal information, you meet certain thresholds, such as, let's say, doing business in the state, having a certain amount of revenue as a business, processing, using, or selling data to individuals or households, or even just deriving revenue for selling data, you may then be obligated to comply with this type of regulation. The challenge is there's really no one size fits all right now. So you have these different laws, there's different definitions of PII right now. And as I mentioned before, there's a different scope, right? The GDPR and the LGBT apply to public bodies, institutions, and not-for-profits. So it covers everything. And they also have extraterritoriality, right? This ability that if you're doing business, let's say in the US, and you're collecting personal data of EU or Brazilian residents, then you may have obligations to comply with those regs. So it becomes very complicated. That's what I'm trying to get at here. And then if you look at California, it only applies for for-profit businesses, but Colorado's law applies for nonprofit entities. So there's a whole host of issues that are coming up. And while it is cross-industry, there are definitely key industries that are impacted. So what we see, where we see this more, big tech and software, e-commerce, retail, banking, financial services, telecom, I can go on, transportation. And it's mostly within departments like HR, finance, contract, sales and marketing, right? Anything that's going to collect data. Maybe you're running an email marketing campaign, right? That would be susceptible. So those are some examples. And so it presents some key key requirements in these regulations that are very common to them all present major problems for businesses. One of the key requirements is that you need a legal basis to process data. So that's an area that, in terms of collecting, categorizing, inventorying, you need to be aware of. The security safeguards that need to be in place to guard against data loss are extensive. There's a concept called data minimization that I think would interest a lot of the record side people who are attending today, because data minimization is really about using the smallest amount of personal information for the shortest period of time, right, before you have an obligation to delete because you've satisfied the purpose for which it's being used in the first place. So these are a couple of things. And then there's another element, which is fulfilling subject rights requests, very similar to like what we see with FOIA, where you have a right to know what's being collected, how it's being used in shares, and they can make requests and they can ask for it. They can ask it to be deleted. They can have it to be transferred. So there's all sorts of complications. And then there's major impacts on consumers. We did a survey, OpenText did a survey back in 2020 where we surveyed 12,000 people worldwide from a number of different markets around what their views were on privacy, their perceptions, their knowledge. And that finding revealed that 73% were either aware or somewhat aware of these new laws. And it's empowering this community, right? There's a global empowerment, so to speak, where there's a greater understanding of these rights and obligations. I just mentioned it with subject rights requests. This is forcing businesses to be able to respond. And it's not enough just to be able to know where the data is, but you got to respond rapidly to meet these requirements. So these are just a couple examples, Kevin, of challenges, impacts, plus some of the trends we're seeing.
Some of the impacts, what are the impacts? You're a lawyer, litigator. What are some of the impacts in terms of not being in compliance and the implications of having data that I may not know I have, or may be risky that I don't even know that I have? What are the implications to organizations? Is there real teeth behind it, this?
Yeah, I mean, organizations are very afraid of not complying with these regs. And you mentioned it before in your introductory bit, right? The regulatory penalties, staggering. I mean, if we look, not to scare everyone, but if you look at serious infringements of the GDPR, potential fines are up to 20 million euros or 4% of an organization's worldwide annual turnover, which is revenue, whichever is greater. And actually, I think this is really fascinating. When the GDPR was first in effect, you saw a lot around data breach, right? There were a lot of different fines and penalties. Now we've seen that change with more around transparency around how data is being used and those programs. So it's changed. And two of the largest fines to date happened this past year in 2021. Most of you may have heard about the Amazon Europe. They were issued a just under $800 million euro fine for how they use data. And then WhatsApp Ireland was issued a 225 million euro fine, which is the second largest fine. So that's one area. And you mentioned something from a lawyer's perspective, Kevin. This is what I find really quite interesting. A lot of these regulations obviously have, this administrative penalties or enforcement that comes from the regulators, but many of the regulations also have, a private right of action. So you will see instances where GDPR, the LGPD, which is Brazil, California, allow individuals to seek damages beyond these administrative penalties, right? So the statutory penalties, I was a class action attorney when I first started my career, so I'm well versed in this type of area. And if you look at the statutory damages per violation, they're not too extensive. It can be $100 to $750 per violation for breach. But if you start to add this up from a class perspective, it can be very staggering. And I was looking at one of the leading law firms has a website where they track these types of matters. And it turns out that there are about 200 lawsuits right now filed citing CCPA violations. Also, you mentioned, I'm not going to go into too much, reputational harm. So it's not just the financial hardship, it's building brand loyalty. Many of these companies can well afford the financial hit, but they can't afford all their customers walking out the door, right? So that's a big area. And also, making a final point, One of my colleagues brought this up to me fairly recently. Organizations fear what's out there in the dark web. You know, you have this underground, this sort of edge of the internet, not visible to search engines, where a lot of the lost data or hacked data is found. People can buy it for a price. So you have hackers who can fake IDs or, you know, use identities to take out credit cards and steal funds from bank accounts. So these are just examples, Kevin, I think I can paint where organizations are focused on, right? Regulatory penalties, lawsuits, reputational harm, and the World Wide Web causing problems.
We are speaking with Andy Tischholz, Global Industry Strategist for Compliance and Legal at OpenText. And with us today also is Reed Cathcart, Analytics Solutions Consultant with OpenText. So, gentlemen, what do we do about all of this? In other words, what are some approaches to consider and how are organizations addressing this challenge?
Sure. Reed, I think if you can go to the next slide. Yeah, I'm going to talk about this in a second, but just kind of keeping people can look at it for food for thought and try to figure out where I'm going with this. But organizations are, it all starts, Kevin, let me just kind of ease into this way. It all starts with building a privacy first culture. That means embedding privacy into all facets of the business and everyone's thinking. Create that atmosphere where everyone has a responsibility, right, to embrace privacy, safeguard data, enable trust in the organization. And what does that really entail? Well, driving awareness. Don't underestimate the importance of communication and awareness campaigns in an organization. Critical. Some of you may track that there is Data Privacy Day on January 28th. That's a good example. There are organizations that are looking to build events around it. If you have a cleanup day, maybe that cleanup day is associated with that activity. But the idea is to get people more comfortable and more knowledgeable and create awareness and do campaigns that can do that. Educating employees, the more traditional kind of compliance, HR, onboarding, updating, training, right, handbooks, all those activities need to continue with a much more modern flavor around digital data. But you got to really, at the end of the day, make data management everyone's responsibility. Individuals need to take ownership of how they manage data. Team leads need to monitor, evaluate, and report on sort of the hygiene of employees. So the goal is not to punish poor hygiene necessarily, but to just strive for continual improvement of all users, all departments, and they can play their role. So it's not one person's responsibility or even one department's responsibility. Everyone has a role. And one of the things, Kevin, while training helps to reinforce a lot of this, no one's perfect doing it, right? People make mistakes, so they look to technology. So the second way is to, operationalize privacy programs. And that means, taking on data management challenges to reinforce privacy. Do what you can do successfully by implementing information governance frameworks. So the concept of data minimization I mentioned before, a lot of that's very similar to the principles that we follow with records retention. However, those retention periods may be a lot shorter. It could be weeks, could be months. And conceptually, you shift from documents as records more towards focus on mapping records to inventories and understanding why and how information is being used, right? More mature companies can take their existing technology and add on it. Less mature companies can look at new technology. And what's really important here is making sure that whatever they invest in can be of value to others within the organization. Quickly on this slide here, I want to mention that one of the first approaches is to establish a cross-functional privacy team. Critical. It's really important to have convergence of cooperation and collaboration on a team. Activities performed by one department, let's say privacy, have an impact on others, like security. Maybe it impacts the vulnerabilities of a system. I used to be on the working group for the IGRM, the Information Governance Reference Model, so I helped kind of formulate that. And I still use that cross-functional dialogue and collaboration strategy with my approach. And the second thing you need to do is engage in 3 sort of data-centric foundational activities to kickstart the program. Know your data, control your data, and remediate.
Yeah, and Andy, I just want to build on that because that's really where technologists like myself, get involved, right? What are the tools that people use to know their data, to gain control of their data, or to maintain that, that stance, right? And I think that that's something OpenText tries really hard to focus on. So I'm not trying to make it all about OpenText all day long, but we focus on tools for the enterprise. And that means that we try to provide tools that allow records managers, compliance officers, everybody from the boardroom to the mailroom, you might have heard that cliche, to give them control over their processes and their data. And when we look at it this way, I look at this and I think it's linear. Oh, I'll get out there and gain an understanding of my data. I'll get control over it, and then I'll maintain a compliance stance going forward. But we know in practice it's very non-linear, right? That all of a sudden I've got a new business unit, or I've acquired a company, or a process has been folded under my purview, or there's a new regulatory requirement I have to meet. So we end up back in this cycle. And I think that's where tooling makes it easier for us to onboard new data sets, onboard new processes, and manage this content, when it comes into the organization, as we move it through its life cycle, and as we ultimately, move it to business complete. That's where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, in terms of how do these sort of theoretical ideas actually get implemented at the level of the business unit.
All right. Well, Reed, I am thinking as you're talking, how do I do it? How can I assess the risk of my vast amounts of information? And what are the tools that can help me do that? For example, how do AI and text analytics help me assess the risks within all of this information? And how are customers approaching these activities that we've been discussing, and approaching the challenge of all the data?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you talk about the content, because you had that statistic, and I have it here too, about the rapid growth of content and how much there is. And when we think about the challenges we face, that maps out, well, what technology are we going to bring to bear to address those challenges? So certainly the volume of data is a big challenge, and the tooling that we see being used primarily these days is around AI and automation, because of the scale of content. Most of the large companies in US and Europe anyway, but really the world over, they've got just well beyond human scale volumes of content. So it doesn't matter if the focus is privacy specifically, or if it's another security issue. We need tooling that gives our human workers direction and enablement, if not downright automating, the tasks that they're working on completely. So I completely agree with Andy about having a privacy first culture and a collaborative team. But in terms of tooling, what do we equip these teams with, or these business users with? We need to be looking at every tool in the toolkit. ETL tools, regular expressions for like pattern matching, but also certainly AI and machine learning are a big part of that. And I think there are statistics that talk about, is it maybe 60% of privacy tooling specifically is being enriched with AI capability, not because AI is here and we have it available to us, so much as nothing else is working. Humans can't scale to those kinds of volumes. They can't tackle the variety of content that the organization encounters. So it's less about where do we look, and more about how do we look? How can we look across this volume of content in a way that enables us to do those foundational activities? So
how do we do that? Yeah, now I understand you folks have developed a solution to help us do that. Can you tell us a little bit about how it works?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a relatively new product for us. I won't do my shameless promotion for the whole time, but we are hoping to automate a lot of this process and simplify these tasks for business users. So Andy talks about that privacy first culture. I'm a big believer in that. And part of that is getting everybody in the organization on board. So we focused on using the AI to make it easy for individual business teams to get engaged. So that's what our product, which is called Magellan Risk Guard, really focuses on, enabling whoever is going to be the privacy team member at a business unit level, or the compliance representative at a business unit level, and give them the tools to discover what's in their organization that's not being managed in a privacy compliant way, or potentially poses these kinds of risks to the organization. So it's really about using the AI to scale, and all that other tooling too, right? With ETL and computer vision for looking at your audio and video files, but then getting that in the hands of a business user who does not need to know or understand all the technology behind it. It's not an IT thing, it's a business thing.
Very good. Can we see a quick demo?
Yeah. I have one here. Let's take a quick peek. So you can imagine if you're a business user that has file shares or content repositories that are not folding into that privacy compliant methodology. So another shameless plug: if you're not using an open text, privacy compliant content repository, maybe you should be. But if you want to get this content into one of those compliant repositories, I as a business user can now get a quick landscape view of what's out there that might be of a potential risk to me and to my organization. And I can target first the highest risk items that come out. So there's AI models here that are being used to identify if these documents represent absence and leave or financial and tax or performance records. And I can go in and start remediating those. And in this case, when I say remediate, I mean, identify that this content needs to be moved to a secure location and move it. It's really not particularly high-minded effort here. Show me what I've got because I wasn't looking at it before, and let me take an action on it. But if we scale that down to the business team and then allow them to scale with AI, we give them the ability to move much more quickly on this content and not be as intimidated by that petabyte and zettabyte scale, not be intimidated by the rapid growth of content. And if you'll let me do just one more little plug, the first thing our customers said is, that's great, but I need to tailor it to my requirements. So we give you the ability to say, well, what's high and medium and low risk based on the privacy regs that you're under. And so that gives you a little bit of flexibility without training models from scratch to make sure that these models match with like your policy and whatever you need to comply with.
Okay, very good.
I think actually, Kevin, we'll be at the AIIM conference. Not to get the cart before the horse, but I would love to talk more about it, of course, because I care very deeply about this product and continuing to grow how it works for users out there. But I think if we don't have enough time now, we can certainly talk more in Denver.
Very good. All right. So, Reed and Andy, how does OpenText help with all of this? Do you have any resources that we should consider? We'll see you there in Denver, but any other resources that you might consider before we get to our question and answer part of the program today that you might recommend as next steps for our attendees today?
I think it's all here on the slide, which we'll share with everyone, but certainly opentext.com is always a great place to go.
All right, everyone, we are here with Reed Cathcart, Analytics Solutions Consultant with OpenText, and Andy Tischholz, Global Industry Strategist for Compliance and Legal at OpenText. These folks are experts at data analysis, e-discovery, information governance. Let's open up to your questions today. Let's take advantage of these experts today and ask them your questions. So feel free to type into the question and answer feature or even the chat feature, and we'll pick up your questions. And let's go ahead and do that now. But gentlemen, one question that keeps coming up in my mind as we're talking, what happens now that everybody is working from home? How does the work from home trend that most organizations are still working with affect all of this?
Yeah, I might ask Andy to jump in. For me, I haven't seen as big of a dramatic shift because for my organization, the content that's out there that we're trying to discover and remediate is the content that's out there, and it was on the network, whether our employees were sitting at home or in an office. But I do think there's some improvisation happening since the big shift to work from home, where people that used to work in an office might make different decisions about where to store something or how to transmit it. Andy, can I unfairly call on you to speak to that too?
No, of course. I mean, I agree. I think part of it is the question of how much control there is in the environment. There is definitely, Kevin, just in general, whether it impacts what we're talking about entirely now or not, there's definitely been a resurgence in shadow IT, or this idea, where individuals are saying, I need to get things done more efficiently. So they start to bypass acceptable use policies, in their organizations. Home offices obviously were set up in a hurry at the, during the early days, especially with COVID, without proper planning. So people are using those devices to store information, and from a compliance and risk perspective, it just becomes extremely difficult to assess and monitor that information. What are they doing? Where are they storing it? And if you're not using the data on appropriate networks, then there's obviously IT or security vulnerabilities, right? So the data is more susceptible to cyber attacks and data leaks. And then I would say, one of the challenges, one of the things for me, based on my background, is more around what is the impact up to the legal team in terms of data preservation, e-discovery activities. So there's a bit there. Historically, when you have an obligation to preserve or meet legal hold obligations, when there's a reasonable anticipation of pending litigation, or you're in a litigation and there's a notice, you rely heavily on IT to support a lot of the preservation functions on the system. So what you have is, with this data out of control, it becomes a greater reliance on employees, and the courts have frowned negatively on that topic.
Okay.
So.
Very good. Well, we are getting questions in from our attendees today. This one's from Norman. Norman asks, what approaches does this solution use? Machine learning classification algorithms?
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you for the question, Norman. Yes, there are, out of the box for this solution, there are more than 25,000 machine learning derived classification algorithms. There are also other models involved as well, including well, I shouldn't say algorithms for all of them. So sometimes it's just about pattern matching with regular expressions. There's also something called composite AI, which combines machine learning backed models with either other machine learning models or with regular expressions and similar programmatic approaches. So there's quite a lot in the box to unpack. But the meat and potatoes, as you correctly identified, Norman, is machine learning derived classification models, usually for those classification types that might be regulated by a legal precedent like GDPR or GLBA and others.
All right, very good. Another question from our attendees today. Will there be the capability to add your own custom terms in the future?
Yes, actually, there is. It's available out of the box already and surfaced through a separate UI. That's kind of for admins. We didn't want regular business users to feel like they need to type in their own terms, but it's absolutely possible. And more, under the hood of this tool is actually a very robust analytical capability that I would encourage you to visit us at AIIM or reach out to us through the website so we can talk you through it more. Some folks will maybe get a little bit intimidated by the amount of technology under the hood, but there's quite a bit there to deploy against your tools.
We talked a lot about risk, and in my opener, I also talked about the opportunity of information, and even this unstructured information, even the tsunami of information we manage has some opportunity in it beyond pure privacy and addressing content risks that your customers are exploring. How are we exploring the opportunity side of that equation?
Yeah, I can speak to that, Andy. You may want to as well. What I see is really coming out of the both IT and business is it's not really always about privacy. There's a lot of talk about that in the market right now, but what we see actually is a number of privacy tools being used to cull content before a migration, especially cloud migrations. Customers our customers anyway, don't want to move sensitive content or outdated content, what you might call rot, up to the cloud. If it's out of date or it's business complete, they want to remediate that or dispose of it or move it into an archive before the migration. So migration is a big one. But I've heard a few others, especially around mergers and acquisitions and like IT rationalization for cost reduction purposes. Andy, I wonder if you wanted to jump in too, but that's sort of what I see at the IT ground level.
No, I mean, I see it as sort of an advanced tool or an enrichment tool that supports some of the sort of defensible disposition and other types of projects that I've been engaged in the past, certainly for this audience around information governance. We know that that can be a broad topic. So a lot of the ones you alluded to, in my experience, a lot more about just sort of categorizing and organizing information within the company. I mean, I'm not even speaking from a risk perspective. I mean, there's a whole host of different benefits it has for compliance, proactively knowing where that data, what kind of impact it has in terms of evaluating, areas of improvements with different departments based on where you can actually identify the information. But that's more of a risk topic. But I think that surrounds some of your points, Reed.
Well, what about affecting something like customer experience, using information more powerfully to build a superior customer experience? Have you had are your customers doing any work on those at that kind of side of the equation, the opportunity side, if you will?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the most common one for me is in consumer products, because they tend to be leaders in my experience in terms of looking at the feedback they're getting, because of course they make a consumer product, so they're interested in how that product is perceived in the market. So whether it's like looking at the first one I got was about Twitter. Let me look at Twitter and see who's tweeting about about my product, which
Customer sentiment. Yeah.
Anybody who's Googled their own name, though, is often disappointed. They're like, why aren't more people talking about me? But the discussion is out there, and reading into customer sentiment and emotional intent, if there are other sort of buying signals that customers give, picking that up is very common and happens early in consumer products, but it's happening now everywhere. It's happening in banking and insurance. So I'm seeing that has really been a big groundswell the last number of years, at least in terms of looking at like natural language processing and reading what customers and employees and experts write. That's a very hot topic.
Well, we are coming close to the end of our time with Reed Cathcart and Andy Tischholtz from OpenText. If you have any further questions for them before we need to go, please put those out there now so we can pick them up in our last remaining minutes. Reed and Andy, what's one good example of one organization that has been successful using these techniques? What did they do, and how can we do it too?
Sorry to keep taking the mic, Andy, but I'll jump on that one. I've had a few customers in financial services that have deployed these tools for the express purposes I described. One was specifically around mergers and acquisition. If I'm bringing in a new business unit, I don't know what I've just bought all the time, or as I'm planning a merger or an acquisition, I might not have all the details. So being able to surface that is a hot topic. But I think number one above all right now is absolutely looking at culling content before a migration. That is absolutely the hottest topic that I've seen, because migrations to the cloud offer so many cost-saving opportunities for customers, but it depends on the scale. So managing that scale is a big deal.
Let me just add one point to that. This idea of managing unstructured data has so many different areas of focus when it comes to privacy, right? So if you're dealing with, I mentioned earlier very briefly, the concept of subject rights requests, and you have individuals that need to gather this information. So in addition to sort of the value, Reed's maybe talking about, or the support you need on that side, there is value in terms of how quickly that information is captured. So doing that kind of culling, classification against unstructured data at the early stage. We talked about that, Reed, as the foundational, know what you have, right? Control your data. And that slide earlier, that is a key point to sort of expediting the response time, which improves customer experience, right? Which allows that customer to feel connected to that company or confident that that organization knows what they're doing with their information.
All right, gentlemen, that is Andy Tischholtz and Reed Cathcart from OpenText. Andy and Reed, thank you so much for being our guest today on this AIM webinar. At this time, I think I'm going to turn it back to Nina and say, hey, Nina, welcome aboard. This was Nina's first time leading one of our webinars, and I'm so happy to have you with us. Nina, I can't go to Denver here in April or here in the next week or two. You are going to be attending for your first time at AIM. How do you feel about attending the AIM conference for the first time?
I'm super excited, Kevin. I've been hearing so much great feedback from the previous years. I've seen the pictures, I've seen the video recaps, and this year promises to be a conference unlike any you've ever experienced. So from the great keynote speakers, like our very own Peggy Winton, who's CEO of AIIM, to Dr. Karen Hardy from the US Department of Commerce, IBM, Walmart, even OpenText. I'm really excited to have this comeback, from lockdown be a sensational one. So AIM 22 is an event where work gets done together to solve information-centric issues. So feel free to contact hello@aim.org and we'll help you book your seat. And you can visit aimconference.com for more information. So I am really much looking forward to it. And as we're bringing this to a close, I do want to say, we're recording this webinar, so you can definitely catch anything you want to hear again. Look to the chat for the resources and the survey that we would be giving for our feedback. Thank you to our underwriters, OpenText. Without support from our solution providers, we wouldn't be able to bring you free educational programs like our webinar. Also, as we bring this to an end, I would like to ask Reed and Andy if you guys have any closing thoughts or takeaways. Reed and
I was on
Andy, do you
mute.
have any?
I did everything so good until the very end. So I guess, we didn't talk about, some of the other, Reed had showed some pictures of risky content, right? We showed the visualizations through the demo around other ways that this is helping organizations. So, whether you're using this for data privacy or enforcing corporate compliance or even doing some ethical monitoring to prevent certain kind of behaviors in an organization, such as, reviewing harmful content and stuff of that nature, the use of AI and data-driven analytics is a large part and a necessary part of any compliance program going forward. My note is we're seeing this much more in terms of what organizations are expected to do in the face of regulatory scrutiny. So that is driving some of this. And obviously, this is allowing compliance professionals and other risk professionals the ability to make informed decisions, offer more protection and greater confidence that the risks have been properly evaluated and remediated.
Yeah, and to build on that, the technology that allows us to do this beyond human scale has grown immensely in the last couple of years. The regulators are using it. So we believe that you need to be using this within your organization too, not necessarily just any one particular tool, but these kinds of technologies to enable you to get your arms around this content if you want to keep up with the pace of content growth and the kind of requirements that both your customers and regulators have. So we believe, I certainly believe, the time is now to start getting our arms around this content. But certainly, thank you for letting us share our perspective with you.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. What about you, Kevin, from the interview chair? What are your closing thoughts?
Well, this is great. These tools are great. Look, you don't know what you don't know. And the fact that over and over again, analysts tell us that, 60, 70, 80% of content in our repositories is redundant or obsolete or trivial, tells me that often we don't know what we have. We don't know what we don't know. So understanding and identifying what's hidden or what's overlooked or what's risky in our repositories is vital for a number of really important reasons. And these tools are fantastic ways to do that we frankly just couldn't do just a few years ago. So it's an exciting time to be looking at this idea of what you have, what risk it represents, and what opportunity it can provide.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And this is the end of our webinar. So we will say for AIM, this is Nina and Gobidi, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.